Hey y'all, welcome to today's video where we're going to talk about how not to spend all of your money when you first start a business. Alright, so in today's video we're going to deal with the topic of alternate ways to obtain the equipment that you need without spending a ton of money. And to me, one of the greatest ways to do this is a lease instead of a purchase. So with leasing equipment, what this means is that you don't own it. You pay a monthly fee. There's a beginning term and an end term, and at the very end of that term, then you no longer have use or ownership of the equipment. I'll start off by saying that I'm really not a fan of doing this personally for personal finances, and what I mean by that is I tend to keep costs low. I tend to want to pay everything with cash. I want to own everything, and I want to have it paid off. Obviously, some stuff is going to require a loan at some point. Vehicles here lately have been too expensive to purchase with cash, and unless you're really doing good. And same could be said for houses. So with the housing market constantly on the uptick, it also doesn't make sense to pull out of any investments that you have necessarily to purchase things cash when currently, and granted that's about to change, but currently interest rates are still low enough where you can leave your investments alone and actually borrow money towards what you want to purchase. So for businesses, you could almost say that the opposite of this is true. For example, during my time in the corporate world, I noticed that more and more things were starting to transfer away from company ownership and more onto a subscription model. And this really came on the heels of the outsourcing movement that followed the dot-com bubble burst back in the early 2000s. So instead of keeping staff on hand to perform things like accounting, payroll, and even as far as software development, companies slowly but surely figured out that there were other companies that would take on the risk and responsibility of maintaining their own employees, but were able to provide a service to a business. So no longer did everything need to be in-house. You could actually save cost and lower your risk by farming a lot of these tasks over to somebody else. And yes, eventually this did lead to a lot of jobs being offshored. It just happened that way because of the labor rate. I'm not necessarily a fan of it, but it is what happened. You might already know this because you'd been caught up in it at the time. I know that I certainly was. So following the dot-com bubble burst, I was fresh out of college with a degree that should have landed me a job easily. I was told when I started school that I probably wouldn't even have the opportunity to finish school. Somebody would probably snap me up while I was there just because I knew how to plug in a keyboard and turn the thing on, making a lot of money. But really what the reality was is that I graduated school and struggled to find work, much less anything in my field because of so many jobs being offshored and moved on to dedicated software development firms rather than working for the original firm itself. So the real benefit to companies with doing this was that they could farm off all of the responsibility of these roles to other companies and not have to maintain employees by providing them benefits or withholding taxes, anything like that. They didn't have to make a long-term commitment to employees. They could reduce their staff and therefore save a lot of money. Generally in a business, your biggest cost is labor anyway. So what we really need to do here is examine this trend and how it can apply to a micro business. So starting with my video on delegation, I basically said that you need to hand off roles to other employees or to outside firms or freelancers. Basically, you hand off portions of your business, functions of your business, to those other entities in order to free up your time for strategic planning. So in your business, if you think of the equipment that you need in a similar fashion, then maybe you can start using this approach for your benefit as well. So a lot of tendency is to use things that you have laying around. I know that I've been the one that's telling you to use what you have already. Use the knowledge, skills, equipment, tools, all of those things to start a business. So if you think of the equipment in your business in a similar fashion, what this means is that you can transfer off some of the ownership responsibility, some of the tax liability, and the need to dispose of a lot of your business capital in purchasing equipment for your business. You can farm the ownership off to other entities and still retain a lot of the benefit of it. So there's really three reasons that I stress doing this. The first is the obvious tax liability. So equipment owned by a business, and this is definitely true in my state and I know many others as well, that if you own equipment, it's subject to business personal property tax. You have to think of this as an asset that is being used to generate income. So using things that you currently own for a business, while to get started can be useful, eventually those things are going to wear out, and they're going to wear out at a faster pace being used in a professional capacity. This can be problematic if you have some personal attachment or sentimental reason for something wearing out long before it's time. To me, there's no sense in it being destroyed if it has some sort of personal value to you. So ultimately, if your business doesn't have the liquidity to cover an equipment purchase, then leasing might be a better compromise in order to obtain the equipment that you need. So the inspiration for this video came from two conversations that I had last week with two friends of mine. Both of these people were looking to start their own business and faced a very similar problem. I wanted to create this video to share the advice that I gave them and examine the two specific cases that they both had and what was needed really to get them off the ground and running. So the first is my buddy Steve. Steve wants to start a dirt working business with a tractor, a truck, and a trailer. So to save on cost, he's been looking for something that would both meet his needs and be at a reasonable cost and not be just completely clapped out. So in today's market, that's actually a pretty big ask. Everything that we're seeing out there, I've even been helping him look for some. I have a little bit of knowledge of tractors and heavy equipment. So in helping him search for everything, what I've noticed is that it's really difficult to find anything that's not just absolutely tore up. The price that you want to pay, you're literally buying just old tore up junk. If you do find something that isn't, then basically you're paying what you would used to pay for a new piece of equipment for that price. There's essentially no middle ground. Not saying that there isn't any middle ground, I'm just saying that you would spend a lot of time that could be used elsewhere looking for that perfect piece of equipment, that diamond in the rough that you're looking for. Sometimes that's your only option, but what I'm telling you is that by playing the averages, you probably have a better chance of meeting your needs, not wasting a bunch of time, and actually getting to work and generating revenue. Steve also doesn't need just the tractor, he needs the truck and the trailer to move them from site to site. He currently has a little economy car, and I'm trying to help him get into a truck and trailer the same way so that he's able to get something that works as a complete package and does the type of work that he's looking to get into. So I'll stop here and make a note of the fact that there's a lot more to starting this type of business than simply going out, purchasing equipment, and going to work. There's been a lot of research on the back end. There's been a lot of case studies. There's been a lot of calls to other contractors to assess what brands, what types of equipment, what type of work is out there, what type of work is in demand in his area. There's a lot of stuff that's gone into this first, and so Steve is actually at the point of his business plan where he's purchasing equipment in order to begin taking on work. He can't do work without this equipment. And so this is kind of a keystone task for him. He has to purchase this, then he's able to go to work. I just wanted to let you know that there was a lot of stuff that had happened in the background outside the scope of this video to take care of that. So getting back to Steve's situation, I typically stress that keeping costs low is kind of the paramount thing of starting a business, bootstrapping, if you will. You want to keep costs low, you want to keep debt low, and you want to do that in an effort to reduce risk. But in this case, we're noticing a difference that if you're buying older equipment that does have heavy use on it, you run into a couple of issues. First of all, it might break down more. Generally, older equipment that's been used a lot more is going to tend to break more. It might have been wonderfully maintained, it might not. It's hard to make that assessment unless you really study and know equipment and know what to look for. The other thing to consider is that if you're working on older equipment, it might be a great deal, but it might be a great deal because you can no longer get parts for this. It's almost a stroke of luck as to whether you pick the right anything when you're dealing with equipment, vehicles that was popular enough to still have parts made for it. Another way I talk about procuring equipment for your business is to possibly borrow something. Equipment of this nature doesn't borrow easily. You could even go rent, but typically rentals require a large deposit because I've looked into this myself. Rental of equipment requires a large deposit. They may or may not have availability of it when you need it. It might be a smaller company that's providing better rates, but you wouldn't have an opportunity to actually have use of the equipment, but on certain days. And the days that you have, it might rain that day. Another thing about borrowing equipment is that what you might have available to you to borrow might not fit your need, and that's something critical. If you're going to the trouble of getting equipment, you want it to closely match your needs as much as possible. Basically, you don't want to end up in a situation where you're trying to kill a fly with a sledgehammer. So really the only option left for Steve without spending a lot of money is a business lease. He's gone and looked at several tractors at dealerships, and in conversations with him, he said that the tractor companies themselves don't lease the equipment themselves, but there are leasing companies that specialize in these types of leases. You just have to ask a lot of questions to find out what the names of those companies are and maybe what some of their terms would be to see if it's a good fit for you. This solves several needs in Steve's business. So in Steve's case, that he wouldn't be spending time constantly fixing old equipment. He wouldn't be dealing with any kind of downtime issues waiting on parts to arrive for these things. He will end up with new equipment that stays under warranty, and at the term of it, he goes and gets even more new equipment that will be under warranty until the term of the lease expires. The leasing companies that offer these sort of things also have the understanding that they're being used for work. This isn't the same type of lease that you would expect to get off of a new Accord or a Camry. So the second scenario I'd like to get into is my friend Jerry. So Jerry works for a company that manufactures parts for other manufacturing plants in the area. Jerry drives a box truck delivering these parts on a regular schedule to these other plants so that production continues. He is basically a part in a JIT, or just-in-time manufacturing strategy, where only the parts that are needed for that day's production are delivered. So basically, when he delivers parts, they're for the next day's production. So while this is a very efficient process, a problem can happen if there's a defect on the manufacturing floor, where a small part is needed, or part of any size really is needed, but it's needed immediately and a replacement wouldn't be available until the next day. So this is where we get into the concept of a hotshot load. What happens here is that any part, from a large subassembly to anything as small as just a cardboard box that's been tied and stapled to a pallet, needs to be delivered, but it needs to leave the plant immediately and arrive at the other plant so that production can continue. So rather than the company hiring a team of drivers that sit around drinking coffee all day waiting on this possibility to happen, what the company does is farm this off to individual providers, and these are known as hotshot loads. So in my conversation with Jerry, he was telling me about the going rates for these types of loads and wanted to eventually transition into this. He's getting close to retirement age, doesn't want to continue working, but he still wants to have income coming in and eventually retire. So after discussing a little bit with him, I came up with a plan where he would not only be able to transition into this type of work, then I showed him a few things as to how to grow this business into passive income after retirement. Jerry also recently bought a brand new truck. It's a little compact pickup truck, perfect for pulling loads. Even if he put a trailer behind it, then some of these smaller hotshot loads, he would easily be able to fulfill, maybe doing one a day, a few a week, basically at a frequency that matches his time and schedule. So initially, I'm a huge fan of his plan. Use what you already have, start a business that you know has demand, you know what the revenue is, you know what your expectations for income are going to be. Everything lines up. There's opportunity, there's willingness. You've got a business basically in a box there. The problem is he just bought a new truck and wants to keep this truck new. When you're running these types of loads, typically you're driving anywhere from 100 to 200 miles to the next manufacturing plant. And if you're adding 200 to 400 miles a day round trip onto your vehicle, it's going to get out of warranty. It's going to get worn out very quick, not to mention all of your operating costs from gas, tires, and oil basically these days. So really, in this case, I think the best advice for Jerry would be to get a separate truck and trailer. You can also do a little bit of research when you're deciding which vehicle to purchase and which trailer to purchase, things like common tire sizes, the type of oil that it runs. Basically, you want to make sure that whatever you do purchase can be maintained and kept running as cheaply as possible. If Jerry does go forward with his plan and wants to use his personal truck and trailer to run these type of loads, then to me it highlights another aspect of running a business that can help save you some on tax and liability. So if you personally own equipment that you want to have business use of, you can retain ownership of the equipment and then the business will pay you a lease. So in discussing leasing versus purchasing, you definitely have the opportunity that any equipment that the business itself purchases, you can write that off against your tax liability. At this stage of your business, you're likely not going to have a large pool of capital to deal with. And so that way, making any kind of large purchase at this stage can really make future operations hampered. It's really not a good idea to part with a lot of liquid cash at this stage of your business. So for my friend Jerry, either way really works out great for him. If he decides to use his own personal truck and trailer and then the business pay him a lease, or if he decides to go out and get a separate truck and trailer that is strictly for business use, either way seems to be a really efficient use of resources. This also helps him keep any downtime risk very low. Eventually, as Jerry gets closer to really wanting to retire and step away from the business, he can hire more drivers, lease more trucks to keep revenue coming in, and then he can focus his time more on being strategic and then eventually sell the business or bring somebody else into it that he teaches how to run the business and pass it on when he's ready to retire. So always remember in these types of situations with the business, you want to pay yourself out of your business account as if you were an employee of the business. So wrapping up, what I would like you to take away from the video is this. The type of business you decide to get into, the one that most closely aligns with your interests, your abilities, and your skills, may require more than just basic hand tools to get going. But I want you to know that there are ways to get the equipment that you want, the equipment that your business needs, without having to purchase and while keeping your downtime risks low. Hey, I'd like to take a second just to say thank you for watching my video. Make sure you please like and subscribe, and when you get a moment, check out my website, CameliaStartup.com.